Chief Economist Chifipa Mhango of Don Consulting examines how Venezuela's oil industry, once its strongest asset, has declined due to political and policy decisions. He explains that political instability and mismanagement have weakened the state-owned oil company as government leaders prioritized political survival over long-term investment. Now, this neglect, along with the loss of experienced staff through political purges, has led to a sharp drop in oil production and prevented the country from fully using its vast reserves. He joins us now to expand on these thoughts. Good morning, Chifipa. Thank you very much for your time. You write that Venezuela should, in theory, be among the most prosperous energy companies globally. Why is the gap between theory and reality in Venezuela so extreme compared to other oil-rich states?
Good morning to all your viewers. Yes, indeed. You know, the history of Venezuela on the oil industry perspectives, as well as its political dynamics, has all been shaped by the oil industry. From this fiscal structure, from the foreign policy, social contract with its people, as well as the political power dynamics in Venezuela has been shaped by the oil industry. I think the key element is, just, if I can just take your viewers into the historical perspective, is that Venezuela was actually a colony of Spain from 1498 all the way to when it gained its independence in 1821. So from 1821 to 1908, the whole structure of the political space in Venezuela was actually a dictatorship. Now, in 1908, there was then an alleged sponsored coup to which Gomez took over as the president of Venezuela. And then from 1908 all the way to when Gomez was the ruler of Venezuela up to 1935, that's when most of the oil companies from the USA heavily entered into Venezuela. Companies like Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, they all entered the US market. And they did a lot of investment in terms of production with regard to the oil sector. During that time, actually, the production was very high, almost over 5 million barrels a day. But then in 1976, when Perez took over as the leadership of Venezuela, he then nationalized the whole entire oil industry in Venezuela. And he created a state-owned oil company called Petroleos de Venezuela, which is PDVSA. It was during that time, that's when the whole fiscal structure of Venezuela changed, whereby now there was heavy reliance on the oil industry in terms of funding. The fiscals, almost 60% of the funding for public spending, subsidies, social programs were all done using the oil revenues from the state-owned company which was created. And right. I think further on
that note, though, what are the economic consequences when technical expertise are replaced by political loyalty, when engineers and geologists are replaced by party loyalists in running an oil company?
Well, that's when you have the issue of institutional decay, which transpired from 2002, when most of the 19,000 workers were actually fired, and most of them fitting the category I've actually explained. So that led to an environment where political patronage became the key factor, and most of those who are actually managing the institution, the PDVSA, were actually not even qualified to be in that space regarding to managing the institution. So that led to issues of lack of maintenance in the oil sector, infrastructure decay, and then that led to lower production. Currently, the country is only producing less than 1 million barrels a day. And that's what happened because of the institutional decay that occurred in the PDVSA, which is a state-owned oil company created in 1976.
Sure. So, Chifipa, why do national oil companies become especially vulnerable to corruption and inefficiency?
I think the case of Venezuela was more or less like a oil industry being used as a political competition, so to control resources in the country. So if I share the history, you said, no, Venezuela was the history of dictatorship, the history of coups have all happened because of the oil industry control. I think that, in a way, destroyed the element of foreign investment into the oil industry. Technology was actually on the lack in terms of development. You're looking at the element of finance access, which is very key in terms of the oil industry, but also market access. So all that was denied. And I think to make it worse, the sanctions by the US also even destroyed the whole environment further.
Now, can an economy structured around patronage ever reform itself peacefully?
Well, it takes the element of both political as well as economic reform, political in the point of view of how you manage your environment democratically. In terms of institutional reform, it obviously looks at issues of the whole entire investment environment. So, for example, stable property rights, you're looking at transparent regulation, you're looking at professional management of the institutions, but also policy stability. And I think those elements need to be reviewed if Venezuela has to move forward.
Now, in your analysis, Chifipa, how does the source of government revenue affect governance quality? Why does a government funded by oil behave differently from one funded by taxing its citizens?
You know, in any economy, there's what we call economic diversification. So you can't rely on one sector to provide you with all the revenue or finances in the country. So that's when you talk about the development of other sectors. So what Venezuela did not do is that not taking advantage of the oil industry, which could have been used to build productive capacity, industrialization, human capital development, as well as infrastructure development. So this, once the oil industry was affected by sanctions, and also markets being closed, access being closed, as well as technology development being closed, obviously that means that it also affected revenue base of the economy from the fiscal perspective.
Sure.
And that's where Venezuela is at this stage.
Right. And you describe Venezuela as a case where political choices crippled a strategic sector. At what moment do political decisions become economically irreversible?
Well, they become in that situation when the incentives are misaligned in terms of what key sectors you want to progress in the economy. They also, as I said earlier on, it also leads to the element of institutional decay in terms of how you employ people. So political patronage is always mixed with political choices. And that means that if the quality of staff you have in an institution are not what the institution deserves in the oil industry, then obviously it leads to the way Venezuela has actually been progressed itself in the oil industry.
Sure, and our resource-rich countries often end up in complex relationships with foreign powers and investors. So how do these oil-backed loans and preferential supply arrangements constrain future economic policy?
They do, in a way. If I can give you an example for Venezuela on its own, Venezuela was actually mortgaging its own production in terms of loan repayment in the future. So you find that a loan of, let's say, $50 million will then be said, okay, we're going to repay this with production we're going to have in the next 5 years. And I think that already sets an economy towards failure in terms of how you're going to manage your fiscals. I think that's a danger of having a resource which is poorly managed, and which is the case of Venezuela in terms of mortgaging its production.
Sure. And Venezuela, as we know, nationalized its oil industry decades before Chavez. So economically speaking, where did nationalization go wrong?
Nationalization went wrong, I think, in the sense of from 1998 when Hugo Chavez took over, where the issue for political patronage, which I've mentioned, became the order of the day, where the state-owned oil company became an environment of where political barriers or deployments was actually done. And that, in a way, I think, as I said, destroyed the element of quality staff who left the country. I mean, you're talking about almost 19,000 people in the oil industry living for countries like USA, Spain, among others. So that already tells you that to rebuild the oil industry, it means that you must now entice those people, technicians or engineers, back into the country to rebuild the oil industry in Venezuela.
Right. Now let's bring it home. Many African economies are resource-rich and fiscally constrained. If you were briefing African finance ministers today, what are the 3 warning signs that they should be watching for?
I think one is about institutional capacity building in organizations. 2 is about economic diversification of the countries in terms of progression, building other sectors of the economy alongside the oil industry or even the mineral industry, but also fiscal discipline in terms of how you manage those revenues from the minerals or be it from the oil industry. I think that is the key 3 areas one can focus on in any economy.
Fantastic. Chifipa, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
That was Chief Economist Chifipa Mhango of Don Consulting.